Hi everybody and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. I'm your host, Philip Heidson. So you've just been appointed to a new CPO position. Your executive leadership team is looking at you to make an immediate impact while setting up procurement as a driver of sustainable long-term value. Your first 100 days, they can make or break your career. But where do you start? Well, today is day 2 of a special 5-part series. It's brought to you in partnership with Efficio, the world's largest procurement consultancy firm. This series provides you with the roadmap that you need to hit the ground running. And in this episode, I spoke with Vikas Tyagi to discuss some of the steps that a CPO can take to create a high-performing procurement operating model, from assessing the suitability of their inherited model to designing a fit-for-purpose organizational design. Vikas is a principal at Efficio. He has more than 15 years of experience in procurement and also leads Efficio's procurement operating model practice. And I started the conversation by asking Vikas, what exactly is a procurement operating model and why should a new CPO consider changing their inherited model?
It's interesting because different people have different understanding of what an operating model means. And what we're seeing in the marketplace is that the interplay between strategy, people, process, and enablers, which is what the operating model is, that there's a clear need of having a relook at it now. And the reason primarily is because typically procurement operating models have evolved in response to changing needs or demands, and it's been quite reactive, to be honest. And what that has done is organizations have not really kind of taken a step back and understand what's working, what's not, and what is it that they really need in the future, so that they can either reset their operating models for procurement or design it in a way that works for the future. And given the changes in the technology space, changes in people's aspirations, changes in what is expected of procurement, it's just the right time to look at the wider procurement operating model and then come up with a view on what's going to work for in the future. And essentially, if you think about that, especially for new CPOs or new leadership who are focused on the procurement side, it could be CFOs or CEOs as well. It's a great opportunity to just reset the requirements, the needs, and then work with the teams to deliver the strategy that the business really wants procurement to deliver.
Yeah. Now, for a new CPO who's come into the role, is looking at the existing operating model, what are some of the cues or signs for them to know whether the operating model that they have inherited is actually delivering the best outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, a number of factors, to be honest. So the first thing to understand is what does the business really feel about procurement. So obviously, we all try and talk to our teams and understand how they believe that they are delivering value, but I think the most important aspect is what is the customer speak, or in terms of when I say customer, it's your internal customer essentially. So you're working with different functions in the business. You're working with the leadership of the business to deliver either cost targets or deliver kind of better services. So the first thing that we recommend is to always just go and talk to the business outside of the procurement team and understand how they perceive the value or the service delivered by the procurement is being seen at. So that's the first thing. But equally, I think not to say that the perspective from the team is not required. I think the second aspect is just to take a step back, look at all the building blocks of procurement, which will include all aspects of, as I was saying earlier, strategy, the people aspect, the process, and the enablers. Looking at those and coming up with a little bit of an assessment on which are the gap areas, where do we excel, because it's also equally important to identify your plus points and your strong points. So that's kind of a good starter to test the fitness of purpose, and to not only just deliver the ask, but to think that are we set up to deliver more than the ask in future, and what's going to be required in the future.
And I'm assuming as part of that, when you're starting to do that kind of gap analysis, what's really important is understanding the true needs of the business. What does a business need from procurement? And perhaps there is an opportunity as well to really sell the value proposition of procurement to the leadership outside of procurement, because they may not have had exposure to what that could look like.
Yes, exactly. And you're absolutely right. I mean, just understanding what the outside world, and when I say outside world, it's the people outside of the procurement team, really believe procurement is doing for them, or what it should do for them, because there could be disconnects in both aspects, to be honest. So, one, procurement is doing stuff, but it's not visible enough, or it's not communicated well enough. And that creates a little bit of a gap or a disconnect, which needs to be looked at. And secondly, procurement is not aware what some of the requirements are, or sometimes these are hidden requirements or tacit requirements, which are not really out there in the open, and nobody communicates them well enough, but it's just an expectation. Right. So yeah, both sides of the coin need to be looked at in more detail in terms of what the business expects, and what the procurement seems to believe what they are delivering. Yeah. But I think I'll add on to that another point, which is sometimes even the business would not know what they want out of procurement, because different people will have individually or from a team basis or function basis different kinds of requirements. But whether these make sense at the wider strategy level for procurement to do or not do, that needs to be thought about. And that's where I think procurement leadership needs to step in to say, okay, the overall business objective is this. This is how then it aligns to the procurement requirements in the future, not just today, but in the future as well. And then now let's go back and communicate that to all the business functions, that these are the requirements, these are the asks, this is how we will deliver it, and equally do that same with the team within. So I think it's not enough to say that, yeah, let's go and talk to the business and get requirements, or let's talk to the procurement team and understand what they are doing. I think it's also important to look at the wider strategy for the business, look at what competitors and best-in-class procurement departments and teams are doing, and then use that to create the function of the future to say, okay, these are the requirements that we will deliver, which will set up the business for success.
And so, as a CPO has decided that we need to take a look at the operating model. Perhaps the operating model isn't delivering the best outcomes or aligning procurement with the needs of the business. What are some of the key elements that the CPO should consider when they're actually looking at designing a new operating model?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So traditionally, and I alluded to that briefly earlier, traditionally the focus areas for procurement have been, from an operating model perspective, everybody seems to think it's about team and organization, but that's only part of the puzzle, because there are a lot of other aspects in the wider kind of operation setup that need to be looked at and understood from a dimensions of an operating model perspective. So if we try and break that down a little bit in a few blocks, then the key dimensions will be around strategy and mandate. So what strategy exists at the organizational level that needs to be then delivered by different departments, and then what is procurement's role in that? The mandate, so equally important. So you might have a great strategy that then kind of creates another subset of a strategy for procurement team and function to deliver. But does the procurement team or function have the mandate to deliver that? Are they kind of given the right responsibilities? Are they empowered well enough to be able to deliver that strategy? That's very important as well. And because I've seen that in a number of organizations where a certain strategy is expected to be delivered, but then the procurement organization doesn't feel empowered enough to be able to deliver that, which again is a disconnect. So that's the first and most important thing to start with. Organization people, so absolutely that's a critical and important part of it. So when I say organization, it means how the teams are structured, who are they reporting to, what kind of dotted lines, solid lines exist, what is the detailed RACI or the RACI matrix between different teams and departments. So it's not just about procurement people, but stuff that is happening outside procurement, related to procurement, and how our responsibilities and functions kind of delineated properly. Is there clarity between that? And when we move to the people side of things, it's around the capacity, the capability of the people. Do the numbers that we have internally the right numbers? Yeah. Do the skills the team have are the right skills? Do these need to be refined, updated? How do we go about that? The core capabilities, which are a number of kind of core processes in the organization, which procurement, that is a kind of procurement's core delivery. So, and I'll start with category management. Then there's strategic sourcing, which links to category management. But if we kind of dissect the two, then the actual process of going to the market and engaging and appointing suppliers. And then linked to that towards the back end is the supplier management and contract management side of things. So how do you continuously manage your supply base even after the sourcing process is over to make sure that you are delivering value or the suppliers are delivering value to the organization. So that aspect. And then finally, the key enablers. So everything that's sitting around these three things that we looked at, which then enable the procurement teams to do these things efficiently. So be it technology, be it processes, be it governance and compliance, risk management. So those kinds of aspects need to be looked at as well. So all these together form the building blocks, and that's why we say don't focus on one or the other. Of course, you can prioritize, but you need to look at all of them in entirety to be able to say, yeah, this is where I need these dimensions to be in future, and this is where we need to kind of progress to make an organization for the procurement setup which works.
Yeah, so lots of different kind of activities, work streams, everything's kind of all interconnected with each other. So a CPO has their plan now. They've got their target operating model. It's one thing to have that target operating model on paper and another to actually implement it and to, kind of work on the change management associated with it. So what are some of the key things you see that are successful, that procurement organizations who are implementing their new operating models, are able to manage that change, to get everybody on board within the organization to that new model?
Yeah, I think the way to look at this will be, I don't think it's a one-step process. It's a continuous process where you will need to continuously engage with the business, with the leadership, to make sure that there is alignment on strategy. And if things are changing, then how that needs to be reflected in the operational aspects for procurement. So it's the clarity on strategy and mandate and making sure it's aligned to the overall corporate objectives. So checking that on a regular basis is a key measure of how you're doing against the change. The core capabilities that I mentioned earlier and looking at those in terms of how do we deliver those is also quite important to make sure the operating model is delivering. So if you take an example, then it's about, okay, these are my core capabilities, but am I measuring the right kind of success aspects, or am I measuring things that are outside of my control? So looking at that is also, it's also quite important with equal kind of, I'll not say focus, but at least an oversight on what is non-core to me and how is that being delivered, because that also reflects in the performance of the procurement team. Then finally, I think a couple of aspects, to be honest. So if you look at the definition of success, if you can't measure it, then you can't really report it, right? And it's hard to say what's success. So agreement on key metrics and the kind of parameters that procurement is measured on, it has been narrow in the past, in my view. So savings has been very important and continue to be, but equally there are other aspects which I think will become more and more important in future, when saving is not just the only thing that procurement will be expected to deliver. So I think just definition of these metrics very robustly upfront, and of course you align with the leadership to say, tracking on savings, tracking on kind of service levels to the business, tracking on looking at new innovative way of delivering supplier improvement. So those kinds of things need to be thought about and brought into focus to say then, yes, we are meeting those objectives and we are delivering against the plan. And then not to discount the fact that you need to look at a 360-degree approach to understand the efficacy and efficiency of delivery. So not just talking to leadership, but equally the business departments, which I mentioned earlier, but also the users on the ground, right? So they need to be there needs to be some sort of a model around which you engage them and understand, okay, how do they believe and perceive the services being delivered from procurement. So all of these together need to be kept in view to be able to say, yeah, the operating model is performing and we are delivering to plan.
Okay, so my last question today, this series is all around the first 100 days of a CPO. And, from the different areas that you shared in terms of going through that journey, how would you look at this from a timing perspective? What are some of the key decisions that you would anticipate a new CPO who is looking at building a new operating model, or really seeing if the existing operating model is fit for purpose? What's that timeline usually look like?
Obviously it depends on how, at what pace there needs to be change and are there other priorities, etc. in an organization. But if we look at a standard case on, new CPO needs to look at. So in the first 30 days, for example, I would focus on developing and a little bit of an outside in, because it's still new, still trying to get into terms with the new environment and setup, but at least having an outside in view, high level view of evolution of procurement operations. So where did it start compared to how has it evolved over time? What has been working, what's not? Developing a perspective of that in discussion with the internal leads in the team, in discussion with some of the key stakeholders in the business who interact with procurement quite a lot. So that to me is the first step, because that will tell the new starter that yes, what is the perception outside and what is the perception inside, and of course you use your discretion around and your experience to understand and refine the detail around that when you progress further. But within 30 days, that's the first thing I would do. And then moving on in about 60 days or 2 months time from start, there should be a good view of the stakeholder map from a procurement operating model perspective. So not just people, but also functions, understanding the interfaces that exist between procurement and other teams, the level of interactions. So there is an interface, but what is the actual level of interaction? Is it good? Is it not so good? And that kind of perspective needs to be developed. So that to me is the key. It will take a little bit of time, not done in the first couple of weeks or first few weeks, but takes a bit longer. So that will be the next step in my view. So you look at what metrics in the past were used to measure performance, how well the organization has been doing in those areas, and have these been enough, right? So have these been the right kind of criteria? So developing a perspective on that would be the next step in my view. And then if you look a little bit beyond, when you're talking about 100 days or 3 to 4 months time, then I think that's when you are really getting into the detail around developing a view of the key future objectives, because you've now had interactions with the business, you now had interactions within the team, and you also know a little bit about the user base that interacts with procurement on a regular basis. So and of course you're bringing in external perspective as well. So developing this initial view of the future objectives, not just today's requirements, but the future objectives of procurement. Having a plan against it, at least an initial one, to undertake a detailed assessment. Now, then you start mapping out and say, we are here today. In 6 months' time, or 12 months' time, or 3 years' time, this is where we need to be or want to be, and these are the actions that need to be then kind of initiated against those. So that to me, in I think 3 to 4 months time period, where other priorities do not completely take over, I think is something a new CPO, we would expect a new CPO to start looking at.
Hi there, I want to thank you for listening into today's podcast as part of our series that helps you take the actions that you need in your first 100 days to position procurement for long-term success. If you'd like to get more insight into how to approach your first 100 days, or to reference all the tips that are covered in this series, Efficio has created a handy downloadable checklist. It's really easy to grab your copy of this checklist. All you need to do is go to artofprocurement.com/100 days. That's artofprocurement.com/100 days.